Today is a hand quilting trunk show. If you love hand quilting, or maybe you are interested in learning how to hand quilt, then this is going to be the video for you. Hi, I'm Corey of Coriander Quilts, and today we're talking all things hand quilting. This is actually the first video in a series of 4 where I will be talking about hand quilting. I will teach you the techniques that you need to hand quilt, and then in the final video of the series, I will be sharing a perfect project to practice your hand quilting skills. For today's video, I thought it would be a great way to jump into this series by sharing a hand quilting trunk show with you. Now, this is going to be a pretty newsy, chatty video, so if that's not for you, you can feel free to check out one of my other videos. But I love talking about quilts and quilting and piecing, so I am excited about this one. You're going to get a little bit of my quilt making history in this video as well. So let's just rewind a few years, and I'm going to take you back to when I was growing up. I am from generations of hand quilters and quilt makers on both my dad's side of the family as well as my mom's side of the family. And so growing up, my mom would have a large quilt in the quilting frame in our living room, and we would have aunts and uncles and grandmas and great aunts over to hand quilt. And I have such fond memories of these quiltings. If you have ever been to a quilting bee, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Everyone is surrounding the quilt. They are all hand quilting and laughing, and there's always good food. We would often have a carry-in, and so I have wonderful memories of that growing up. If my mom didn't have a quilt in the frame, there was always a quilt-in at my grandma's or at my aunt's, and so we oftentimes were at these quiltings. And as you can imagine, growing up with that going on around me, you might think that I just fell in love with quilting and wanted to dive in and try it. But that was quite the opposite. I think because I was surrounded by it so much, I didn't have as much interest in it when I was growing up. But my mom required that all of us try hand quilting, and so we all tried hand quilting on one quilt or another, or in my case, many quilts. We got to practice hand quilting. And it was after I moved out. I got married young. I got married when I was 19, moved out of the home and started buying fabric, if you believe that. I did not do any kind of sewing at home or piecing at home, although I did try hand quilting. I didn't do any sewing, and it was after I moved out and fell in love with fabric and started buying fabric that I then became involved with quilt making. And that has been a really interesting journey for me. I am going to now show you what I consider to be my first quilt, and you can tell me in the comments below if this counts or not. I think it does, but you might disagree 100%. But this quilt right here is what I fondly call my first quilt. And I'll tell you the backstory to this quilt, and then we're going to talk about the hand quilting on this. My husband and I were visiting a quilt shop in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And as a quilt maker, you probably realize that Lancaster, Pennsylvania is a wonderful place for quilt shops. And we were newly married, and we were shopping in fabric stores. Like I said, I fell in love with fabrics before I started making quilts, and I started buying the fabrics and needed something to do with the fabrics, which was what led to the quilt making. We were in this fabric store in Pennsylvania, and I just fell in love with a maple leaf quilt that they had for sale at this shop. They didn't have the pattern, and I came home determined that I was going to make a maple leaf quilt. So I went to Joann's and I found a book that had this pattern in it. It's a template-based pattern, and I went to my local fabric shop and I picked out what I thought were the prettiest fabrics, full of little bits of glitter and a wide variety of colors. And I went home and I made my templates with my cereal boxes, and I cut out this quilt, and then I sent everything over to my mom's, and she pieced it for me, and she also hand quilted it. So I'll leave that up to you to determine whether this is actually my first quilt or not. But let's go ahead and take a look at the hand quilting on this. We are going to talk about this more traditional type of hand quilting that you're going to see on this quilt. And then we're going to move into big stitch hand quilting, which is the same technique. The supplies are a little bit different. And obviously it just looks a little bit different, but across the board, it's very much the same, just different stitch lengths. So this is probably what you would have grown up with or what you are familiar with in regard to hand quilting. And as I said, my mom did hand quilt this. When she was growing up, she was also required to not just try hand quilting, but to become proficient at hand quilting. And her mom wanted them to be able to do that before they got married. So she always says, I learned how to hand quilt fast, which I think is funny. So she is a very proficient hand quilter, and she's very fast, and she has very nice stitches, as you can see on the back of this quilt. I fell in love with quilt making after this quilt, and I really dived headfirst into making more quilts. The quilt behind me is the first quilt, the first pieced quilt that I made, and I hand appliqued the bits, the viney pieces, and the little coins here. I don't know the name of this pattern off the top of my head, but I'm going to look that up and I will link that in the description box below. If I have pattern information, that's where you're going to find it. I know I'm not going to have pattern information for everything that you see because it's been about 25 years since these quilts were made, so it's been a little while, but I will link to everything that I can. But this one uses Kansas Troubles fabrics. I think this was probably one of the first times I realized that you could buy fabrics in lines, and actually this was made in early 2000s, so fabric lines were somewhat new. And I'm going to take this down and show you the quilting on this one as well. And here is this quilt, so you can see the quilting a little bit better. This one is not going to show up as nicely as the last one did, as far as being able to see all of those little stitches as you could previously, but it gives you a great idea of what the hand quilting looks like. My mom, when she hand quilted this, she did sort of a viney design on here to mimic the vines that were in this quilt top, and it's just a lovely quilt. It turned out so well. And I love having this rich tradition of hand quilting. I know the amount of time that goes into hand quilting these quilts, and I also know that it probably wasn't just my mom who quilted this piece. There would be many hands working away at these quilts, and I love having that sort of history in a hand quilted quilt. It makes it really special. Behind me is probably the second or third quilt that I pieced. I am a big fan of just diving into a quilt project. I'm not intimidated by too many different techniques, and I always sort of feel like if it doesn't work out the first time, you just try a little bit harder and you'll get it on the next time or two. So this one again has applique. I really fell in love with applique pretty much from the get-go, and I had a lot of applique in my first quilts. And this was a project that I saw in a magazine. I was also getting all of the quilting magazines. I had so many subscriptions, and I would pick them up whenever I was out and about. Once I started piecing quilts and buying fabrics, I was all in. And I still get very excited about quilts and fabric. We are also going to take a look at this one up close. For the quilting on this one, you can see that my mom did sort of an echo around my little applique shapes. And then on the insides of these blocks, she did an orange peel. Again, just sort of mimicking the applique shapes. You can see it. Oh, maybe you can't. Let me slide it over here a little bit. In this border, you can see also there is sort of an orange peel petal kind of design. And you can see, let me just slide this here a little bit. See the quilting a little bit better on the back. Now at this point in time, I really didn't have any interest in hand quilting these projects myself. I was very happy to send things over to my mom, and she was more than happy to quilt them for me. And there wasn't, at least in the area where we live, there wasn't a lot of machine quilting options. There weren't very many people machine quilting here. And prior to when quilting just took off online, there wasn't a lot of information available if you wanted to send your quilts to be machine quilted somewhere else. So when we made a quilt, it got hand quilted. And I remember when I very first talked about sending a quilt out to be machine quilted, my mom was, I think, a little bit horrified that you would send a quilt out to be machine quilted because they always got hand quilted, which it's really interesting to see how far machine quilting has come and kind of how the practices have changed. Now, we're gonna jump to something a little bit differently. I mentioned big stitch quilting at the beginning of this video. You have probably heard of big stitch quilting, or you may have heard of long stitch or pick stitch. These are all techniques that refer to the sort of hand quilting that has the bigger stitches and wider spaces in between the stitches. Now, I mentioned that the techniques are the same, and they are. So you can see how different, and when we look at this up close, you'll see how different these hand quilting techniques look. I shouldn't say hand quilting techniques, how different these hand quilting styles look, because the technique is the same. Now, this is fast forwarding a number of years from this quilt that you just saw. When I started designing fabric for Moda, I knew right from the beginning that I wanted to also utilize hand quilting in my pattern designs because I love the way it looks. And it was when I realized and saw my first big stitch quilt that I really fell in love with hand quilting, and I had a desire to do it myself. So with my first few fabric lines, I would very intentionally design a quilt that lent itself very well to showcasing hand quilting. This quilt is called Ginger Snap, and I released this pattern with my very first fabric line, Prairie. And we'll take a look at this one up close too. And here is the Ginger Snap quilt up close. Now, I cannot take credit for this quilting. My mom quilted this quilt for me as well. When I was thinking about having quilts hand quilted for Quilt Market, I knew that that was not something that I was going to be able to do. I am not nearly as fast at hand quilting as she is, and the turnaround time from when we receive our fabrics and make our samples to then having them on display at Quilt Market is sometimes just maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So we do not have very long before we need to have these completed, and there would be no way that I would be able to hand quilt a project like this in time for such a short deadline. But my mom can, because she's very fast, and especially using the longer stitches, this method goes quite a bit faster than the smaller stitch length. As you can see on this quilt, we have all kinds of different colors, and that is one of the things I love about big stitch quilting is it really shows up so nicely on a quilt top, and you can use a lot of different colors if you want to. You don't have to. You could certainly blend those thread colors a little bit more if you wanted to, but I just love the color that this brings to a quilt top. On the back, it's not going to show up as well on the dark background, but you can get an idea of what it looks like. This quilt is called Persimmon, and it is a pattern I designed for my second fabric line, Sundrops. And again, it had so much wonderful negative space that I just envisioned for hand quilting. And again, colorful threads, big stitches, and I just love what it adds to this quilt. And the quilting up close, colorful and delightful. At least that's what I think. The back on this one, I just love it. I just think it adds so much to a project. Even if it is just a little bit of hand quilting, I think it adds just such a special touch. And then back here is a quilt pattern that I designed for Pepper and Flax. Now, this pattern would work beautifully for Buttercup and Slate fabrics, which are just about hitting quilt shops. If they're not there yet, they'll be there in a few weeks. So this pattern is called Dappled, and when I was designing this pattern, I even went so far as to plan how far apart I wanted the quilting lines and made sure that the measurements in the pattern worked really well for the spacing. So you can see everything goes right through where I want them to on my pieced pieces. I'm going to show that to you up close because I think that's going to make more sense. So here you can see how the quilting just perfectly highlights the pattern, and the spacing is just so perfect for the quilt pattern. And I love how it all came together. We used just a gray thread for this quilt. And I cannot take credit for the quilting on either this quilt or the last quilt because they were both made for Quilt Market. And that timeline is so quick. So at this point in time, you might be wondering, okay, you're doing a whole video about hand quilting, but have you actually hand quilted anything yourself? The answer is yes. Yes, I do. And so what I'm going to show you next are some of the projects that I have hand quilted. I have hand quilted quilts up to as large as maybe 48 by 60 or 60 inches square. But what I have found that I enjoy most is hand quilting small projects. So I really like adding hand quilting to project bags or pillows, table runners, or even small wall hangings. And that is what I'm going to be sharing with you here. Sew together bags. I know many of you have made a sew together bag. They are a wonderful project to add hand quilting to. And it's just a little touch of hand quilting, but it's so cute. It's so cute with that added detail. Pillow tops, simple patchwork is wonderful to add hand quilting to. This is just envelope enclosure on the back and just a simple patchwork pillow. Another pillow, just so simple to add hand quilting to. And as I said, I'm adding the pattern information for these projects in the description box below. So you'll have pattern information for all these projects that I am currently sharing with you. This little guy here, this is called Neighborhood, and just cute little houses. It's just a mini quilt, and I added hand quilting, and it's just such a small project. The hand quilting doesn't take much time, but it adds so much to this project. This was a table topper that I did for a Martingale book that I contributed to, and you can see just that little bit of hand quilting just really sets what would be a simple quilt. It just takes it up a notch, and I think it just really adds to the project. And I really love this little mini quilt. This is a mini version of my freshly cut quilt pattern, and these are just the sweetest little flowers, and then just a little bit of hand quilting to this project. The project was super cute on its own, but then just adding just a little bit of that hand quilting just makes it even cuter. You may have seen this project on my channel most recently. This is in my Oh Happy Day book. It's called Solitude, and again, just a little bit of hand quilting to really kick this pattern up a notch. So those are some of the projects that I've hand quilted. I had more that I could share with you. I had more that my mom's hand quilted and my grandma's hand quilted. We have a lot of hand quilted quilts in our home, but I just chose some of my favorites and some that I thought you might be interested in seeing. Now, if hand quilting is something that you would like to try, maybe you're not ready to dive into a big project, but maybe after seeing some of these smaller projects, you're thinking, I think that would be fun to add to a project. You are going to want to stick around for this series. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about hand quilting supplies. This is going to vary from person to person. I'm going to share what I like to use and reasons why you may or may not choose those same supplies. But it is going to give you a great jump start on choosing what you would need to build your hand quilting supplies that you might need. And then in the third video, I'm going to actually show you how we hand quilt. We use the rocking stitch to hand quilt. I'm going to show you how to do that, how to start and stop. Sometimes we need to start and stop stitches in the middle of a project. How do we keep our stitches looking somewhat tidy on the back, because they don't tend to look the same on the front and the back, those stitches. So we'll talk about that, and I will walk you through what you need to know to actually learn the technique of hand quilting. And then in the final video, I'm going to share a project that I think would be a perfect beginner-friendly project to just try hand quilting out, and you can see what you think. So I hope that you stop by again. As I said, there's a lot of information in the description box, and if you subscribe to follow along, you will be sure not to miss any of this fun series. I hope you love it as much as I do. I will catch you again next time.